All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Liberal Arts Alumni Mentor Program Fall Webinar Series. Today, we will be focusing on trends in law school admissions. So we hear a lot from mentors who may have a few years of practicing law under their belts that they're maybe not sure what the current law school admissions practices are or trends that are going on, especially in light of COVID. So for that reason, I am very excited to bring you today's topic and have the ultimate pleasure of welcoming Kathy Guerin, the pre-law advisor for the university. So Kathy, I will let you take it from here.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm happy to be here. First, just to give you a little bit of background on me. So I am also an alumni from the College of the Liberal Arts several years ago now. And I went to law school. I went to Northeastern and practiced law for about 8.5 years, mostly family law litigation, both in Boston and then here in State College, Pennsylvania, before I transitioned into this role of pre-law advisor. And I've been doing this work for about 8 years now. I can tell you that as I transitioned into this job, I learned a lot about the admissions process that I wish I had known when I applied to law school. As I was saying to Lauren, just because you successfully get into the law school that you want to go to doesn't necessarily mean that you did it in the best way possible or that you know everything about law school admissions for sure. So I've learned a lot and things are changing. So thank you, Lauren, for having me here today. And thank you to all of you for what you do for our students. So I hear from students all the time who are interested in law school who say, I don't know a single lawyer. I don't know what this really is about. No one in my family has ever considered this. And so I think it's really important for them to have a mentor. So thank you for what you do for them as well. I wanted to make sure I said that before I forgot. So here's my plan and sort of where I'm going to go with this, but I'm also totally open to questions along the way. Lauren's going to monitor the chat for me. So I have a couple of trends, sort of what's happening right now, things that are changing in law school admissions that I want to cover. And then I'm happy to jump into law school admissions in general, timeline components, right? Answering any questions that you have. So I can be flexible as to where we go sort of after the trends in terms of law school admissions. So that being said, I'm going to jump in. Note my email is here. If you have questions afterwards, please do feel free to send me an email. If you're ever working with a student and you have questions, one, you can always reach out to me, but two, send the student to me for sure. And Lauren can help them get to me as well if needed. She knows where I live on campus. All right. So last thing I will say is that I'm available to students at all Penn State campuses. So I'm housed at University Park, but I am available to students across all of the campuses. So, all right. So what is happening in law school admissions these days? And it's okay if you can't see these numbers, but the most important thing to know right now is that the numbers of students applying to law school is going up. And this is different than when I started in law school admissions post-recession, when numbers were really down. So law schools are seeing both an increase in applicants and an increase in numbers of applications, right? So more students applying to more schools. So just, I think the takeaway here, so this is current data. They track it every day. So this is as of yesterday. Current applications were up 1.8% from last year, but compared to 2 years ago, they're up 36.5%, right? So last year, there was a significant increase in law school applications, driven in large part by the pandemic. We certainly don't have great data yet on those reasons, but I think most folks are saying the economy, the pandemic, students who were considering law school thought this might be the right time to do it. Maybe I'll just go straight through the law school, or folks who are in the work world thought maybe this is a good time to make a shift. So applications are up, to be determined what this means overall for this year, right? This is as of today. But things could still change because it's still pretty early in the admissions cycle. So trend number two, as a result of trend number one, right, is that schools are becoming more selective. And it is becoming more competitive for students to get into schools. So this is just an example, and not all of these numbers are out yet. So when I say 2021 entering class, these numbers aren't final, meaning audited and sent in to the American Bar Association, but these numbers are coming from the school's websites, from their class profiles. So if you look at this, what you're looking at here in terms of percentiles are the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentiles in LSAT and GPA. Okay, so this is Dickinson Law, which is a Penn State law school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Penn State now owns and operates 2 law schools, right? I am not connected with either one. Here's my disclaimer, meaning I don't work for Penn State Law. My job is to help students apply to any schools that they want to go to, help them get in wherever they want to go. But I certainly know the folks at those schools. So for example, Dickinson Law's LSAT percentiles, this was last year's entering class. This was this year's entering class. So it may not look like a lot if you haven't thought about LSAT percentiles in a long time. But a 153 is about the 55th percentile. A 157 is about the 70th percentile. So there's a big change in percentiles with only a few numbers in terms of LSAT. If you look at Temple, they went from a 157 to a 160. That's also a pretty large jump in terms of their 25th percentiles. GPA also going up some as well. This is not just these 2 schools. This is a trend for sure across law schools in general. The vast majority of them increased both their medians in LSAT and in GPA. Again, some numbers are still out there. Penn State Law at University Park hasn't released their numbers yet, or I would have had them on here too. So as schools are becoming more selective, there's a bit more pressure on standardized tests for students. And this is what it is, in my opinion, unfortunate. Lauren and I were talking about how stressful this can be for students. So there's a lot changing in the standardized test world in terms of law schools right now. The LSAT, the law school admissions test, is still for most students the test that they take. Every school still accepts the LSAT, but newer to the scene is the GRE, the Graduate Admission School Test, that many, not all, but many law schools are now accepting the GRE in lieu of the LSAT. Last count, I think when I looked this morning, I feel like it might have been 76 out of the 199 accredited schools were accepting the GRE. Don't quote me on that one. Take a look. But most of the time I'm talking with students about the LSAT, again, because that's the test that all schools accept. And it's the test where there's a lot of data, right? So when I showed you those percentiles, I showed you LSAT percentiles because most schools don't have GRE percentiles out there yet. They don't have enough students who have taken it to have the data where they can disclose it and share it. So it becomes challenging to figure out what is a good law school GRE score. If you are mentoring a student who has an interest in the GRE, send them my way so that we can discuss the pros and cons for sure. Because they are different tests. I think when the GRE makes the most tests for students is when they're also applying to graduate school, right? So if they can keep both doors open with one test, then that makes good sense to do that. But law schools will see all scores. So if you take the GRE and then you take the LSAT, you still have to send them your GRE scores. So you don't want to take them just to see which one, right, you want to do first. At least don't do that in a way where law schools can see your scores. You can do it on your own in a practice test and figure that out. In terms of the LSAT, though, a lot has been changing, driven largely by the pandemic. So prior to the pandemic, the LSAT was administered at a testing site. So here at Penn State, we had students come to one of those fun lecture halls, big classrooms, but they were taking the LSAT on tablets, believe it or not. So it was a digital test, but at a testing center. That changed, right, during the pandemic when that was no longer possible. And the LSAT went to, and is still right now, administered online through ProctorU, which is an online proctoring service. It's offered right now 8 times a year. And all of this information can be found on lsac.org, which is the Law School Admission Council. ProctorU monitors students' LSAT in a live remote proctoring format. So there is someone watching them take the test, right? And making sure that the security pieces are in place, that they don't have anyone else in the room, that, there's all these rules and restrictions that adds this additional layer of stress, I think, for students with the technology, having the space to do this, downloading the software, making sure it all works. The ProctorU piece is in place at least through the June test of 2022, to be determined how they will administer the test after then. The LSAT content hasn't changed much in a very long time in terms of the types of questions they ask, but how many sections has been changing. So pre-COVID, there were 5 multiple choice sections and a writing sample. One of those 5 was experimental and not scored. When they went to ProctorU during the pandemic, they did it in a version called the LSAT Flex, which you may have heard some of your students talking about. That was a shortened version with only 3 multiple choice sections and no experimental section. They have since gone to, now starting with August, 4 sections. So again, things were really shifting around in the world of the LSAT. Those 4 sections now include 1 experimental. So they had to put the experimental back in to test some new test questions for the future. So as it stands right now, it is proctored online, 4 35-minute multiple choice sections, 1 that's experimental. The sections haven't changed. They're still testing logical reasoning, analytical reasoning, and reading comprehension. Just the numbers have changed some in terms of that piece. So really important that students are going to LSAC for the most current information on the LSAT, because that is changing quickly. The writing sample isn't scored. It used to be done on test day. So when we administered it here at Penn State, they would do the multiple choice sections and then turn right to the writing sample. It is now done online as well, but it's separate from the LSAT. So students do this on a different day. And it is proctored, but it is recorded and proctored. So there's not a person watching them. They basically record it, make sure that it's the student doing the work. If it's not flagged, that writing sample is then sent to schools, so schools can see it. They're using it a bit more from what I hear from law schools, because now they can read it. When I took this, and again, sort of pre-COVID, the year before it was typed, but it was handwritten and scanned into law schools. So imagine 1, trying to read the handwriting, and 2, now you're going to scan in handwriting. So it was really hard for schools to use it. Now it's typed, and now students can move things around in sort of a word processing sort of way. So law schools are really using this to see how well can students write, put together logical arguments when they're under time constraints and when they know it's them, right? It's just them. They're not getting any editing help on this piece of writing. So I think that's changing a bit as well. Stay tuned for possible changes to the analytical reasoning section, which is fondly known as the games. LSAC is looking at possible changes to that for accessibility reasons based on a lawsuit that was brought several years back. So haven't heard anything yet, but that's something that's still sort of out there on the horizon to know about. Again, the Law School Admission Council, lsac.org, writes the LSAT. They administer the LSAT, and it is also the website through which students apply to law school. So all of the schools have their applications loaded into LSAC. So when in doubt, go to LSAC is what I tell students for the starting point for the LSAT and for the law school application process. This is totally different than when I applied to law school. I was telling Lauren, I applied to law school in 1999, and I had to go home over break so that I could use my parents' typewriter to actually type my law school applications, because law schools mailed them to you still. I mean, I had a computer at school, but PDFs or if they were a thing, I didn't know about them, right? So I had to go home and type them. And I know that I'm getting older, but I really, the fact that I had to use a typewriter or something. So now students do all of this through one website. The website is a little clunky, I will admit, but it's getting better and better every year, and it's all in one place. So the GRE, I'm not going to talk as much about the GRE again, because students aren't using this as much. Usually when I mention that there's a quantitative section, meaning math, students immediately say, oh, I'll take the LSAT. But that may not be true if your student is strong in math. So it tests verbal and quantitative reasoning as well as analytical. Oh, I put analytical reasoning. Sorry, it should be analytical writing. So ETS, the Educational Testing Service, is the organization that runs the GRE. So if they're interested in that, they should go there and then come talk to me, because we'll look at it together. I'm going to pause for a second because I know that's a lot about the LSAT. I just talked quite a bit. Are there questions out there about the LSAT before I move forward?
Please feel free to put in the chat or unmute, whatever works best for all of you.
A hand there, Michael. Do you want to unmute yourself? And oh, you're still muted.
Unmute me. Okay. I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me?
You are. Yes.
Okay. A quick question. What's the difference between LSAT and LSAT Flex?
Good question. So the LSAT Flex was the version that was offered last year, the last testing cycle during the pandemic, and at the end of the prior cycle. So students no longer have the option to take the LSAT Flex.
Okay.
Now it's just called the LSAT. So
got it.
We're talking about the Flex, it's a thing of the past. I mention it just so that you can sort of understand that progression. If you're hearing it, that's what they're talking about.
Okay. Thank you, Kathy.
You're welcome.
It looks like Chelsea, you have your hand up if you want to unmute.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can. Hi, Chelsea.
Okay, excellent. So those jumps in the LSAT scores, those are really big. I'm really surprised about that. Do you think that that is a result of the way that the test is proctored with the flex and moving from these different, number of sections? I don't know if there's anything out there, kind of opining on that, if that's, more of like schools being more selective, or if it is, a product of the way that the test has changed so drastically in the past year or so.
Yeah, that's a good question. I can tell you sort of what I've been hearing, but I'm certainly not an expert on sort of that piece of what's going on behind the scenes in terms of the LSAT. What I've heard, so LSAC, the Law School Admission Council, has webinars that students can attend, that pre-law advisors attend. Some are just for pre-law advisors. And they go through breakdowns of tests afterwards. So what LSAC has been saying is that if you look at the trends, the scores, right, the distribution of their tests is pretty similar, meaning it's not that LSAT scores all of a sudden went way up, right, during the flex. There were many more applicants as well, more test takers. So there were more higher scores, right? But I don't know that it's clear or certain whether or not the format of the test impacted that in any way. So again, I am not an expertise on the data behind the tests, but that was my takeaway from a session that I went to at LSAC. So I guess your question is a good one, right? And these changes are happening now. So it's sort of hard to figure out all of what is driving it. But I do know, students were able to be more selective because of the number of applicants that they had last year. So good question. I'm not sure I have a full answer for you, Chelsea, but it's certainly something to think about. Are there other questions on the LSAT before I don't see any, so I'm just going to go to my next slide and we'll see if it sparks more questions and we can figure out then where we want to go from here. So just in thinking about, so what does this mean, right? And I've sort of summarized it. We've talked about this, right? Law school admissions, at least right now, look like they're becoming a bit more competitive for our students. So pre-law advisors in general, and myself included, are encouraging students to apply as early as possible with the strongest application. Meaning you do not need to apply the day that applications open, which is September 1 for most schools. You want to apply, once you've gotten all those components together, and I'm happy to go through those. But you want to be ready to apply early in the cycle, meaning October or November at the latest. So for years, I've told students, if you apply by around Thanksgiving, you're in really good shape for rolling admissions. Last year made me pause, right? So looking at the cycle last year, I have sort of paused and said, you want to be in by Thanksgiving at the latest, if at all possible. If you can be in late October, early November, you're in good shape for rolling admissions, right? So my language is shifting a little bit to try and encourage students to get in a bit earlier so that they don't fall into that big pile that comes in January at many schools after winter break. Is it still fine to do that and apply in January? Yes, most applications are open through the spring. But if they're working on rolling admissions, which most are, they are making offers in the fall. And we saw that last year in larger numbers, right? So that students who were applying in the spring semester or in January, February, were applying to schools that had fewer seats still available. And that, again, makes it a little bit harder, right, to get into those seats. So, or perhaps to get scholarship funding from schools. They have less money in their pockets come February or March than they do October or November. So just trying to encourage students to get in a little bit earlier, I think, is a good tip. And really planning ahead and thinking about the standardized testing. Looking at both tests to figure out strategically which may make the most sense. Most students, if you look at numbers, will say that they study 3 to 6 months for the LSAT. I encourage students to back that plan up and sort of think about 9 months to a year. Better to have too much time and not need it than to not have enough. And as I work with students who are prepping for standardized tests, many of them need to go sort of low and slow, right? They need to practice these skills, let them sink in. And they're also still in school, right? Working through courses, sometimes with part-time jobs, student organizations. They have a lot going on. So if you're thinking about sort of that timeline, I usually encourage students to start looking at LSAT prep in the fall of the year before they're going to apply to law school, right? So if you think about a timeline, you're always sort of thinking about it backwards. So if a student is going to apply to law school so that they start after graduation, they graduate in May is the typical graduation, and they're going to start in the fall. Then they need to apply in their last year here at Penn State, right? And that means they need an LSAT or GRE score before then, right? So if they start thinking about it in the fall of their third year here at Penn State, they're going to be ready to take it over the summer, which is when most students take it. Either this year it was June or August, and be ready when applications open in September to start putting together the rest of the application. So this is what sort of it would look like, right? I don't have LSAT prep on here, which is why I said that piece before I got here. You would really take the LSAT or GRE in the summer before you would apply to law school. And then you would start law school the following fall. If your your mentee is going to take time between undergrad and law school, then they would just push the cycle out, right? You're always going to apply in the fall of the year before you want to go. That is still true. That was true when I applied years ago. That has changed. In terms of gap years or taking time off, that is still something that law schools, it's only a benefit for law school admissions is how I would phrase it. So if your mentee is asking, right, should I go straight through or should I take time off? I'm sure that we all have our own opinions about that. And I usually tell students, if you're in doubt at all about law school, right, then do something in between. Work for a while. Law school will be there. And whatever you do in that interim is only going to help with law school admissions, and quite honestly, probably help you in law school and beyond. So that is something that has also not changed much, although I do think the average age of students starting law school has gone up some. If you look at most schools, it's 24 or 25 for the average age of students starting. Questions about any of that? I see a question. Stephen has his hand up if you want to unmute.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me okay?
I can. Hi, Stephen.
Great. Yeah, I'm trying to understand that timeline for a gap year because I see a lot of students who, are interested in law school, but may want to take that year off in between graduating and going to school.
Mm-hmm.
Are schools like, can you apply and ask for that gap year when you're, once you're accepted, or do you have to just say, no, you don't apply until you're ready to go?
Right.
The following.
So it's a good question. My general advice is apply when you're ready to go. Because there's no guarantee that they will defer your admission. So it's called a deferral is what you're talking about. Where I see deferrals, so if a student is applying to law school and to Teach for America, right, or some short-term defined program where you will be in it for 2 years and then it's complete, the Peace Corps, law schools are generally happy to defer admissions for that, right? They know that student is going to be back. So if a student's applying to both at the same time, gets both, right, then it's likely that a school will say, sure, we'll defer your admissions for 2 years or whatever that might be, so that they don't have to apply again, especially if they're going abroad. Where it's harder is if it's for employment, right? If they're applying to both at the same time, schools may, so there it's a little more gray, and schools will look at the applicant, figure out, how certain are we that we want the student here next year, and that we are willing to sort of already hold that spot for the student. And that gets harder with employment. I think because students are sometimes less likely to actually come back after that deferral than they are in those set programs. And so schools would say, just apply when you're ready. We'll look at you again, just apply when you're ready. So most of the time, if they know they want to do a gap, I would say wait, unless it's one of those short-term programs to apply.
And in terms of if they wanted to take the LSAT, how long is that score good for in terms of, and then they decide they want to wait to apply?
Yes. So the LSAT is technically good for 5 years, but some schools will say they want a 3-year score. So if a student knows it's going to be a year or two, right, then what I would recommend is that they plan to take the LSAT in the summer after they graduate. So most of my students would then prep in their last year. Sometimes that spring of their last year, Penn State is later because they have fewer credits that they still need to complete. And then they have some time to do LSAT prep and could perhaps take it in June, right after graduation, while they're still in school mode and perhaps before they've started that job. If it's one gap year, they would graduate in May. Again, I'm assuming that's what I know students graduate at other times of years, but that's the norm. So would graduate in May and would apply to law school in the fall after graduation, right? So they'll graduate in May, they'll apply in October to start the following fall. If they're going to do 2 years in between, right, then that gets pushed another year, but that LSAT score would still be good. So that's where I would say if they're pretty certain they want to do law school and it's going to be within a year or two, most of my students will take it right after graduation. They might take it in the spring semester too. It is offered during the spring semester as well. Summer is just the most popular because they're not usually competing with classes at the same time to study.
Great, thanks. That's very helpful.
Yeah, you're welcome. Other questions about this? So I have up, and I'm trying to spark more questions, right? So I have a whole deck of slides that I can keep going. Don't you worry. I can talk about law school and law school admissions all day long. So the slides that I have here are slides that I sometimes use with students in my applying to law school session, which I host pretty much every other week throughout the semester. So if your students, number one, if your students have specific questions about the application process, you should always feel free to refer them to pre-law advising, either to me directly or to the pre-law advising website. Lauren, if you could put that in the chat for me, that would be awesome. And they can read through that website. It has a lot of answers to their questions, but it also has links to my information sessions that I am doing, again, pretty much every week. I do a pre-law orientation session, which is designed for first and second year students who are just starting to think about law school. And in that, I really talk about what you can do now to strengthen your application. I talk about what law school is like. I talk about what legal practice is like, so that they can really think about, should I go to law school, right? Is this a good fit for me? And then when that answer is yes, the applying to law school session really digs into all the application components. So those are a resource that are offered every semester very frequently for students. So you should feel free to refer them there. But I will sort of I'll go through some of the application components. Some of these may be the same as when you applied and some may be different. And then see if that sparks more questions. I then have slides for every one of these components if we want to go there. But I know your time is valuable, so I want to make sure I'm answering your questions. So really, this is what makes up an application still for law schools. It's that LSAT score or GRE score, your transcripts from Penn State, and from every other college that students have attended. Community college courses over the summer, dual enrollment that they took, which is high school, right, classes that they earn credit through a college, transfer credits from any other institution. All of those transcripts go in to create your law school GPA that schools are looking at, your undergraduate GPA. I get a lot of questions from students, and I would guess that you might, about things like, does it matter if I double major, right? Does it matter if I have a minor? Do I need to major in poli-sci to go to law school, right? A lot of questions about majors and minors. It is still true that law schools have no preferred majors and no prereqs, right? So no single course they have to take. Concurrent or double majors not required for law school, right? Some students might have multiple interests and can fit it in the 4 years that they want to be here, and that increases the rigor of their undergraduate education. And sure, that is something that law schools see, but it is not something that they have to do. So I think students feel a lot of pressure to add credentials, and law schools really care most about how well you do in whatever you choose, right? So choose something that's a good fit for your strength and interest. If you haven't already done so, focus on that. Because as you know, law schools want students with different perspectives. So if everybody comes out of undergrad looking the same, there's less opportunity for rich, right, conversation and perspectives in those law school classrooms and outside of classroom learning. So the other question I get about transcripts is, what if I have to drop a class, a late drop? How does that impact law school admissions? And I can tell you, if it's a course or two, right, it's not an issue. Law schools will see it, but it's usually not problematic. It's when they see patterns of late drops, students drop a course every semester, that they start to make some assumptions, right or wrong, that the student is doing that for GPA protection, right? They just drop their lowest grade every semester, perhaps assumptions about not being able to finish what they start, taking on too much, not knowing their limits, right? Again, may or may not be true for that student, but those are the possible assumptions. So I tell students your transcripts are your academic story. Your journey through Penn State is told to law schools through your transcripts. So be mindful of the courses that you choose, be mindful of how many credits you take on a semester. You want to challenge yourself, but do well, right? So there's a balance that you need to strike there. So LSAT and GPA are really important. Those two things together for law school admissions. But law schools look at applicants holistically. They actually go through and read every application and consider everything. So that everything else, right, falls into these other sort of more subjective components, which is a personal statement, letters of recommendation, resume, optional statements, and then potential addenda. You don't have to include an addendum if you don't want to, and I'll come back to that in a second. So this is sort of what makes up that application. Most schools are not doing interviews. Some of the top tiered schools will, but most schools are going to make decisions based on what students submit in writing through LSAC. And so I tell students to think about their application as a portfolio. How can they get in, right? Everything that they want, showcase who they are and what they've done in college and beyond, if they're going to work afterwards, and put some thought into how those pieces work together, right? You don't want to repeat. So in a personal statement, you don't want to summarize your application, right? As you all know, if you've been to law school, if you're practicing law, folks who work in law schools can read, right? Very quickly, right? They're generally sharp. They don't need help summarizing. What they want to know in a personal statement is something they can't glean from the rest of your application. And this should be something that is focused on the student's strengths, not on an explanation for something that they think they need to address. That is what an addendum is for. So for example, a personal statement should be more about who a student is, more about their character, their values, how they see the world and how they gained that perspective, how that shapes why they want to go to law school, versus a summary of their, these are the things that I've done, these are the skills that I have acquired, and this is why I will be a good law student, right? They've already got that from everything else that's coming in. It also shouldn't be I had to withdraw from my second semester of college because I was caring for my sick grandmother, right? That is important context that a school wants, but it can go in an addendum so that a student still has space in a personal statement to tell their story. This is really where they get to be a human, right? To an applicant, to a law school, an admissions rep. And I hear from them that this is their favorite part of the application. Many of them, this is where they either really get behind an applicant, right, and want to advocate for them in the process, or not. So personal statement, really important. And there's not, other than that, there's not a lot of right or wrong in personal statements. So I think you can help students sort of shape ideas or talk about how they've come to this point where they're applying to law school. The first question I ask students is, why are you thinking about law school? Tell me more. Because the more they talk about it, and the more they think about it, the better off they are when they get to this point where they're writing their personal statements. So please ask students about their motivations and their rationale for law school, and get them to articulate it and really think about when that started and how that developed, because that could be useful in the application process. I'm pausing because I can keep going if this is useful, but I also can't, it's hard to read the room in this room, right? So I'll go through the other components. How about that? And then I'll stop for questions. And if we have specific questions, we can do that. Letters of recommendation. So most schools, this varies by school, but I think the norm is 2 letters of recommendation. Some schools will take 3. They'll say we want 2, but we'll take 3. They'll want 2, but they'll take 4. Some schools don't require any, but they want them. They're just not setting up an obstacle that could prevent a student from applying. What I hear from schools over and over again is that they prefer academic letters of recommendation because they're trying to figure out, will this student be a strong law student, right? And they believe that the best people to tell them that are people who have had that student in a classroom setting. This has been a real challenge for students in Zoom classes who are applying right now, who spent the last year in remote work. So reassure them if that's the case, right? That law schools know this. And if it's not possible to get academic letters, then they should seek the other types of letters that law schools will accept, which is really from folks in the employment world, internship supervisors, employers, academic advisors, right? But they should really work to try to get at least one academic letter, if not two, from someone who knows them in a classroom setting. That's going to put them in the best shape. Those letters then get sent and submitted to LSAC, and then they go out to all of the schools when they apply. And recommenders only need to write one letter that can then be used for all law schools. So they don't need to write 7 different letters. That's the average number of schools that students apply to. So letters of rec are important, and they're a real challenge both in a time of remote learning, but also at a large university. If they're coming from large majors where they have large classes all the way through, that can be a challenge. So I encourage students to get to office hours, to sit in the front of the room, to raise their hand, to engage, and try and build those relationships as early as possible. Resume for law school is a resume, right? It is just that. There's no special format. And law schools really want to know everything that a student has done in college and beyond. Sometimes I see students omit college experiences because they don't think they're relevant to law school. I would make an argument that it all could be relevant to law school. And law schools really do want to see what they've been involved in, how they've used their time. So I see students omit things like working 20 hours a week in a dining commons, right, while they're in school to make a little money to pay for living expenses. They're like, well, that's not really, that law schools don't care about that. Yes, they do, right? That shows time management, it shows maturity, it shows all kinds of good things, the skills they're learning in that type of work. So encourage them to include those things that they're doing that may not be obviously important for law school. But law schools are looking for service. They like leadership. It doesn't have to be student government, right? I get that question a lot in terms of the student organizations that might appear on the resume. More and more schools are including optional statements. So opportunities for students to write more. This is a great opportunity if students do it and do it well. Again, because of that portfolio piece, they get to say something else, right? To give more information to a law school. The most common optional statement is a diversity statement. Most schools will define diversity within the prompt, so students need to read that carefully. Some will define it narrowly, and some will do so very broadly, and sort of say, give us your thoughts on the importance of diversity in law school and the perspectives that you bring, versus please tell us if you consider yourself to be a member of, an underrepresented or minoritized population, right? So students need to read that carefully, but more and more of them are now broad, where students are really able to perhaps write something about diversity. The next most common is a why this school statement. So Penn State Law at University Park has a why Penn State optional statement, right? So students don't have to do that in their personal statement, right? They can do that in an optional school-specific statement. And more schools are having those. So the good part is that there's lots of opportunities. The downside is this is super time-consuming for students. And lots of moving parts if they're applying to many schools. And in more competitive cycles, students tend to apply to more schools, right? Because they're nervous about where they might get in. So this is pretty time-consuming. And this is what students spend most of the fall working on, because applications open in September, they want them in October or November, right? This is really when they're working on that piece of it. I tell students, if you can do it and do it well, it can help you. If you do it and you do it poorly, it can hurt you. If you don't do it, it's neutral, right? They're not going to ding you for not doing an optional statement, but it can't help you, right? So encourage them to do as many as they can do well.
I have a quick question, Kathy, because I get questions about personal statements when I'm working with my own students in career coaching. And so if these optional statements aren't like an option for them to submit. Would you recommend putting like school specific interest within that letter of or not letter of recommendation, sorry, within that personal statement, just to express like why specifically that school, or do you feel like that should go within an addenda instead?
Yeah. So if a school in its personal statement prompt asks why law, why Drexel, that's a simplification of Drexel's usual prompt, but they usually do ask more specifically why them, then absolutely students should answer the question, right? This is a test of following the instructions, right? That's an easy answer. If the school doesn't, and most don't, I usually don't recommend that they articulate within a personal statement why that particular school, unless they have really strong reasons. And here's why. The first sounds silly, but it's true. Inevitably, they send the wrong one to the wrong school. It happens all the time. Schools tell me like, really, we're tired of seeing it. So are they going to keep, not admit them because of that? Probably not. Are they going to be annoyed when they read the rest of their application? Probably, right? Is that a good thing? No. So if they're going to do it, they need to do it very carefully in terms of that. But I think the bigger piece is it's hard to transition from what is a topic for a personal statement, which is often sort of a narrative of their lives leading to this point. It's not their whole life story, right? But sort of how they've gotten to this point, and then shift to, and this is why I want to go to Drexel in 2 pages, double spaced, if that's the usual requirement, sometimes 3 pages. And it's also a challenge for students to really differentiate between law schools and know what is different about them, because law schools are pretty general in many ways. So when I read them, students write things like they're prestigious faculty, right? Well, that could be any law school. They want to go there because of their experiential learning opportunities. Every law school has experiential, right? So in some ways it's sort of a generic throwaway, and schools stop reading it because they're like, oh, and here's the conclusion paragraph that is about why us, that really doesn't say anything about why us. So it's a challenge to do it and do it well. So long story short, if they don't ask, I usually tell students you don't need to do it. And I hear that from schools. They say they don't need to see their name in a personal statement. That is different than a statement of purpose for grad school, significantly different. So students get conflicting information about that all the time, in part because it's different for graduate school. But if there's a school-specific statement, they need to dig in, right? So they need to be genuine and authentic as to why they want to go to that school, and do some homework to articulate why that school is a good fit for them, and not just fall into that general, it's a really good law school. You have great faculty, which is what they tend to do. So good question.
Thank you. Thank you. That is very helpful.
I think I covered the components generally. Again, an addendum would just be if a student needs to give context to something in their application. If they're afraid that they're going to put it down and have a question and that they have a good answer to, right? I had to late drop 2 classes in that semester because I had mono, right? Or something that is outside of their control. That's where an addendum can be really important. And that should be short and sweet and direct, because you don't want a law school to put down your application and remember your addendum and not your personal statement. So I'm going to pause now for a minute and see if there are questions about any piece of the application process at this point that I can help with. Michael, I see your hand raised. If you want to unmute yourself or.
Okay, can you hear me? I think I
Yes.
unmuted myself. 2 questions, both of them pretty quick. If let's say a college junior is planning to apply to XYZ law school in the fall, does it make any difference? Would you recommend or not recommend contacting the admissions office to say, for your incoming class, do you recommend the LSAT or the GRE scores? Or is that like, just take the LSAT?
So I would recommend that they first go to the law school's admissions website and see if they can find the answer. So some,
Oh, okay. Before making a phone call to the.
you got it. But if they
Okay.
can't find the answer, then 100% it's appropriate to pick up the phone and call the law school admissions or
To see what they prefer.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Most-
The other question
yeah.
was about a resume. Unless I misheard, it seemed that you were indicating that whatever you're doing during your 4-year college career, which you think appropriate for a resume, put on. What about before high school? I mean, should someone say, when I was 15 years old, I worked 3 nights a week as serving tables at Applebee's? Or is that like, don't bother with high school stuff?
Yeah.
I was a cheerleader for 2 years, things like that.
Yeah. So I get that question often, and I see a lot of resumes with high school information on there. The general rule is don't include high school. So college and
Okay.
beyond.
Okay.
There are some, yeah. So that's my general rule.
Okay. No, that
Schools
thank you.
ask
That
for
answers
it.
the question. Thank you,
Yeah.
Kathy.
You're welcome.
Okay.
There are some schools that will ask for them to include every job they've ever held in the application itself, not on the resume, but in the application, in which case they would include that Applebee's job, right? But they would
No.
include it on their resume. Resume would still be college and forward.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Lauren, did I see you unmute?
Yep. So Chris had a question in the chat. So he has a question about LSAT Prep. He knows that Penn State doesn't necessarily endorse a specific prep program, but have you heard good feedback from students about specific programs or study habits that they feel really help their performance on the test?
Yeah, this is a good question. And I like that you already gave my disclaimer, which is I'm not allowed to endorse any particular prep program, Chris. So I'm sure you may have heard me say that or read it on the website. So Khan Academy partnered with LSAC several years back now. I'm not going to hazard a guess. COVID has my timeline all messed up. To create free LSAT prep. So Khan Academy now offers free LSAT prep, which is a great starting point. It may not be the finishing point for students, but it's a great starting resource. I recommend that students start there and do a diagnostic test through Khan Academy. So if they have a full length and an express one, do the full length and see where they're starting from. And I would say do this about a year before they think they're going to take the test. So if they're going to take it in August before their senior year, their last year here, then do this sometime in the early fall of their junior year, their 3rd year here at Penn State. And just see, it's just a baseline. It's not where they're going to end up, right? It's just going to help them figure out how much work they might have to do, which sections they might need to focus on. They might think they know, but until you take a time diagnostic, you won't know for sure. And then Khan Academy has the ability, right, to roll out a course for you. You could say the date that you want to take the test and your goal score, and it will sort of give you a program to work through. Again, it's free. So I would say start there and see how far you can get. The content is good. Some downsides to Khan Academy is that they only have a certain number of practice tests, released exams loaded, and I think it's 12, but again, I'm not sure on that right now. But students start to get the same questions, right? So then they might need additional resources. And LSAC's Law Hub. So within LSAC, students can purchase 70 released exams for $99. Those are just the practice tests, or in smaller quantities for less money. The other downside to Khan Academy is that the format looks a little different in Khan than it looks on the real test now. So students need to do some practice in LSAC or in something else that has the actual format of how it is presented. And LSAC is a good place for that. Beyond those resources, right, you're entering sort of the books and the commercial vendors of the world. So usually I have students do that diagnostic and then come meet with me so that we can talk about what resources might be a good fit. I tell students they run from sort of expensive to insanely expensive, right? They're all pretty expensive. But there are some good books out there if students can learn well from books that are less expensive. Again, I'm not going to endorse one, but you could look at, there's a book, I'll list several, the LSAT Trainer by Mike Kim is a good overall book. Power Score, which is a commercial vendor, has a good set of books. Kaplan has good books, right? The books are sort of the next least expensive way to go, and the library has some of those. So send students to the social sciences library reference desk, and they can help them put their fingers on some LSAT prep materials. In terms of the commercial vendors, then the prep companies have self-paced modules, right? They have streaming live. Hopefully they'll have in person again sometime soon. And they have individual tutoring. And I just went from least expensive to most expensive. And a lot of those programs have scholarship funds or fee waivers if students qualify, but they're expensive. So I would usually say sort of just start with Khan Academy, come see me, and we can start to figure out which books, which companies might make the most sense. There is a list of those vendors on the pre-law website. I'm not allowed to link to them or to endorse anyone, but I don't think there's one, right, that is perfect for all students. And I don't think that you have to do a commercial prep course to do well on the LSAT. I have many students who do it on their own with books and or Khan Academy. But part of that depends on how that student learns, sort of what skills they already have and what they need. So that was a pretty general answer, Chris, but there's a huge list of possible commercial vendors. So hopefully that at least gives you a starting point. And thank you, Lauren, for popping that in there into the chat. She just put the link. We have 4 minutes. Do you have any last? I see Steve, and I see your hand up again. I can't tell if anybody else has theirs up. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I just want to make sure, since we're running time's almost out. Are you going to be able to send us a link to this recording so we can have it for future reference?
Yes, Steve, this will go out as soon as we convert the Zoom link to our YouTube link. So probably tomorrow I will be sending it out to all of the people who have signed up, including those participants such as yourself.
Perfect, thank you.
So I'm mindful of time. I did practice in private practice for long enough that billable hours, mean something to me, and I'm super mindful of the time. I said to Lauren, wow, these folks are probably eating lunch, doing work, and listening at the same time, and I totally get that. But thank you for being here. Thank you for taking time to mentor students. It's really important. And I hear from them often how important these relationships are. So thank you, and please send them to me. That's really the takeaway, is I'm here as a resource on the application process. You do not have to be an expert, right? As a mentor in this world of law school admissions. This is what I do. And even right now, I can tell you keeping track of it is a full-time job. So please do send them to me, and I'm happy to be a resource for you or for your students. And thank you, Lauren, again for having me here. So.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Kathy. I really appreciate it. I know, just to quickly endorse you, I mean, I send students to Kathy all the time just to get some of this information. She's a wonderful resource and a wonderful advisor. So if any of you have any questions about getting in touch with her, please email me or email her directly. Thank you again, Kathy. This was great. It really helps me in my work with students as well. And to all of those who are in the audience, just as a friendly reminder, our next program will be an interactive career self-advocacy workshop on Thursday, November 11th, beginning at 5:15. Mentees and mentors are welcome to be there. So even if you aren't paired with a mentee quite yet, you can please feel free to join us for some networking and conversation. It should last about an hour. And registration is available on the Lion link under the Mentor Program page. But other than that, I will let you all go. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I will be sending this link out tomorrow. So have a wonderful rest of the day, and I'll see you later, Kathy.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, everyone. Take care.